Hello, I'm Doug Keck, and welcome to the Catholic Sphere. You know, each week we tackle topics important to Catholics around the globe with a different host and a different focus. This week our subject is theology, as always when I'm here, and the topic is, does welcoming the stranger know no borders? What's a Catholic to think? Today we are joined by EWTN TV and radio host, the ever-popular Father Mitch Pacwa. He joins us from his set, Scripture and Tradition, right here in Irondale. Great program, check it out. We also have moral theologian, author, papal missionary of mercy, and EWTN host. It's Father Jeffrey Kirby. He joins us from South Carolina. And finally, we're joined by EWTN's Vice President of Theology, as always, Colin Donovan. He's my partner in crime on this program, and he is in our theology studio. Welcome, gentlemen. It's great to be back with you again. Last time we talked a little bit about Ordo Amoris and the statements that came out. This show kind of connects to that, obviously, because it came out as something related to kind of open borders and welcoming the stranger. Let me ask you, Father Kirby, since you had talked about Ordo Amoris, how do you see Ordo Amoris and the response that J.D. Vance gave in relation to our view of what we are responsible for as Catholics and then separately as the United States in welcoming people over our borders?
Yes, I think the Ordo Amoris is very much attached to many moral issues, especially immigration. What responsibility do we have? What are we able to do? What are the limits to what can be done? So all of the questions, the prudential judgments that have to be made by those in political leadership should be guided and can be guided by the Ordo Amoris. You know, oftentimes we have these two extremes where it's either, well, we have open borders and everyone just is expected to come in, or we have this severe understanding of immigration where prosperous nations cease to be generous or welcoming. And Catholic moral theology is right in the middle, and the Ordo Amoris and the exercise of prudence can help us in these areas to find that balance that both respects and protects the nation itself, the host nation, while also being generous and welcoming immigrants into their country.
Right. Let me ask you, Father Mitch, is there a difference? We talked about rendering unto Caesar, Colin brought up on our last program, you know, and to God what is God. Is there also, in some ways, different priorities for what, let's say, the president of a nation is responsible for versus what clearly the bishops in the United States or any other country, or even the Holy Father is responsible for? They have overlapping interests, but sometimes they have different agendas, and they should, right?
They do have different agendas and different concerns. First of all, the federal government and the state governments and the municipal and county governments each have their own responsibilities. And these are stated in the constitutions of each organization. And one of the problems that we see, for instance, in a number of wars that we have fought in the past, it shows up, is a process known as mission creep, where instead of protecting the nation from an aggressor, all of a sudden it starts moving towards instituting democracy, sometimes in countries that have zero interest in it. And that kind of creep of mission, where you increase the mission, happens during peacetime when the federal government continues to keep expanding what it does, sometimes because of mistakes that it has made in policy and has to correct those mistakes. Other times because this becomes a way to gain political power. If I can convince the Congress to allocate funds for certain projects in my district, as a congressman or mayor or governor, then I get more votes. And what we have to do is have a clear idea of, are the politicians letting their mission creep in order to help their own political careers expand, or are they actually doing what is good rather than just using the rhetoric of good? Secondly, what you said before, and something that I mentioned in our previous program, that governments tend not to be as efficient as charitable organizations in getting resources to the actual poor people. And that this would be the role of the church, along with other organizations, to actually get the needed resources, food, housing, etc., clothing, to get that to the actual poor people, partly because people in the churches know the poor people personally, and they know what their actual needs are, whereas the government knows statistics about them and doesn't often know them, and also institutes protections against fraud that often have other effects. For instance, the way that Aid to Dependent Children program in the 1950s became a disincentive for people to get married. It was unforeseen,
Right.
but it was a real consequence. The churches can have a better sense of what's possible and what we can do to actually help real individuals.
And like you said, that kind of unforeseen consequences, one would say that some people, as I go to Colin now, but the idea of kind of having a welcoming country, that you can't have a country that has all these social benefits that are immediately available if you're welcoming everybody into your country, and as soon as they come over the border in some way or another, and there's arguments about how directly or indirectly this impacts them, but certainly they are much better off financially and things like that. But the idea that, of course, people are going to come. Why wouldn't you want to come? People always want to do better. They want better for their family, and that's totally understandable. But at the same time, this isn't, we don't have the fountain of gold or the fountain of youth here where the money wells up out of the ground and that, you just come and everybody can be taken care of. It doesn't quite work that way.
Right, yeah, but I think there's certainly the practical issues of managing the things that are associated with immigration, even if it's just immigration, even if it's completely legal immigration, there's still the necessity of managing in a way which protects the common good. I think what we lack largely in our politics in the United States and in many other countries is we lack prudence. Aquinas said the highest prudence, he speaks about prudence generally, military prudence, the prudence needed by a military in order to effectively defend and to carry out its mission. But there's political prudence he saw as the highest prudence. And if you look at the complexity of the issues, whether it's immigration or any of the social programs run at any of the levels of our government, the complexity is very difficult, and all of the factors which we talked about in the last show that are necessary and bear on the issue requires a sensitive kind of prudence which is very uncommon, not just among politicians, but among people generally. And so you get many good people in government and political offices who want to do, properly and carry out programs in a way that is both beneficial, not wasteful, not corrupt. But on the other hand, you also have a lot of personal interest seeking. So the big difficulty, I think, is the prudential aspect of it. And in the debate over something like immigration, it's very hard to get any traction with anybody when people take the polarities and they more or less hug them and won't talk about, well, what do we owe to those who were tacitly invited into the country by previous administrations? In a sense, the government creating a right that didn't really exist, but people felt that it did. And so there's all kinds of factors I think have to be considered. There's the criminality which has to be dealt with. There's the separation of families. There's women with young children, and especially infants. The prudence necessary to do that requires a very high degree of prudence, which frankly is pretty hard to find these days. So we have a big mess for a lot of reasons, including past governments which made very bad decisions thinking they were in somebody's interests, I think often their own. But we're forced to deal with them now in a way that is just and fair to individuals who are God's children and should expect from us at least consideration of some of these factors.
Right. Going to you, Father Kirby, it was only in the 60s when really the immigration laws were actually updated in such a way to allow even more people legally to come into the country over that period of time. But it seems to be that in the past, some of this was balanced over the fact, without getting too political, by the fact that the different parties had different agendas on particular situations. Many times in the early days, the Democratic Party was against immigration because they saw it as impacting the poor, that was taking jobs away from them or suppressing their wages. They even had that with the farm workers being concerned about people coming in, etc. On the other side now, abortion has obviously eliminated many young people from the workforce here in the United States, which honestly are being basically replaced by bringing in other people from other countries. So from an industrialist point of view, let's say a more Republican perspective, suddenly that becomes a positive agenda. So you kind of have those two things coming together, which I wish I could say was because these people are all worried about these poor people around the world, as opposed to, as has been indicated by several of the speakers, people who see these as serving their own agenda.
Yes, I think that, whenever you have a moral issue that then becomes a political one, you're going to have these different aspects. And I think it's so important for us, especially as believers who are trying to make sense and to understand our moral responsibilities in terms of immigration, is to go back and to realize that before it's a political issue, it's a moral one. And not get caught up in, political interests or ideologies, but to go to the very question, what is the Lord Jesus asking of us as his followers? What is expected of us? And I think the answer to Colin's point is a robust exercise of prudence. I think it's interesting in our Catholic moral tradition, we speak about absolute moral issues, such as abortion, euthanasia, and then we even use the term prudential issues. It's indicating that these are moral issues. Yes, there are moral principles that have to be applied, but there's a prudence. And what is prudence? Well, in popular society, prudence is believed to be, whatever works best for me. But that's not actually prudence at all. Prudence, properly understood, is what is the best possible good. So the best state of affairs that brings about the best good, and first and foremost, of course, a moral good. So what is the best good? And a prudential issue, we apply moral principles. We realize there is no perfect answer to this. And in fact, sometimes I like to point out to people, good people can disagree on prudential issues, on public policy, on laws. And I think we just have to make sure that we are going to prudence, that we're seeking to apply moral principles to try to understand, like, what is the solution? What are some of the answers to these multiple questions that we have in this area of immigration?
Let me ask you, Father Mitch, and kind of going back in time as well, because one of the things we hear about when we're talking here about borders and immigration is the Holy Family. The Holy Family fled to Egypt, obviously to avoid Herod, etc. And some people tend to say, well, see, they were immigrants, they had to cross the border. But of course, others would say at the time, we're talking about provinces under the Roman Empire, in which case we're not talking about sovereign nations and sovereign states. So isn't it different?
It is totally different. It wasn't entering another country. It was all the empire. And that was just an irrelevancy to bring in national differences. Egypt was no longer its own nation. That fell apart with Cleopatra when Julius Caesar took control, and then later on Mark Antony and Caesar Augustus.
Yeah, Augustus defeated them at Actium, and that was
exactly.
the end. Right.
That was it. So this would be more like moving from California to Texas than it would be going to another country. So it's an irrelevance. But there is a need to take care of strangers. The question that we have to deal with, especially in a society totally different, in ancient Egypt, they were not on the state dole. They didn't get that much help. They didn't get help from the state. Except the only place that had a large amount of state aid was the city of Rome itself. Most of the population lived off of the taxation of the rest of the Roman Empire, a system that made for chaos. Nobody could become rich except those who got into politics, while everybody just got sustenance from the Roman government, bread and circuses, that as often was said. Whereas now we live in a society that is much more complicated. Our whole nation has a great deal of support from the federal government. And now we have to ask a question. By bringing in all of these folks from other countries, we are now moving resources from previously favored poor people to another newly favored group of poor people. And one of the objections that you see in many of the large cities is why are social services that were given to our own poor or were never offered to our own poor are now being given to these folks who come in from out of the country? And what is the future of this? How long will this be sustained? And large cities like Chicago, New York, Los Angeles, Boston are finding it very difficult to sustain keeping this much enlarged social program system going. And this becomes one of the differences between what's happening in our present day from a false analogy to the Holy Family going to Egypt. That doesn't apply. St. Joseph would have had to work as a carpenter in Egypt like any other person in Egypt. Here, they become totally dependent on the federal government and the local government, and they take resources away from other people basically dependent on the government. And this brings up a new concept about the application of what Father Kirby was saying in terms of prudence. Is this a prudent way to handle this issue? And why or why not? Explain it to us, please.
Right. It's interesting in some ways, Colin. I think you deal with sometimes this utopian vision people have of saying, well, this is wonderful, we should do this, et cetera. And as Father Mitch said, what we're starting to hear now is all the money that was moved from other areas to pay for these things that people were totally unaware of. It just was these things were going on, and then you'll find out that FEMA's paying for the hotel rooms at the Roosevelt Hotel in New York, and people were totally unaware that this is happening. And there's some people in the Carolinas who think that maybe some of that money could have been better used to allude to what Father Mitch said, to help them out in that situation. Also, let me ask you, Colin, one of the things that I remember was always, that the church's goal was to take care of widows and orphans, people who needed help, obviously, who couldn't help themselves. But there also was this line, I think it's been taken out of Scripture, but it used to say by St. Paul something about if you didn't work, you didn't eat. And that seems to have been something that, it doesn't mean that we don't help people, but the question is, in helping them, are we helping them get on their feet so they can take care of themselves? The last time I looked, the Holy Family came back from Egypt and went back home. They didn't stay in Egypt.
True. I think we have a difference in the analogy is, as Father said, is sort of false, or is false. And I think that would somewhat be true here because, in our society, if you look at the last 60 years or so, we're on the verge of doing what Europe has been doing for even longer, and that is depopulating. And it's rightly said. I don't know that this is the best argument for having enhanced immigration, much less, sanitizing the illegal immigration in some way. But, without new workers, without new skilled people, and that would require training them, the country would have economic problems. So in and of itself, there's no problem with having a generous, abundant immigration. in getting people disposed to work in the society, and we all are familiar with the, immigrants who've come in the last 20 years that, do great carpentry, do other works, and even have risen up into better quality jobs and so on. So clearly, there are populations out there that want to come here and work, and this is probably true among these last batch of immigrants as well. But if you don't have the prudence to ask the question and to figure out what is a just answer to this in a particular case, then you end up at the two extremes, as I said. It's either deport everybody or welcome everybody, and both of those are non-starters for the reasons I think we've all given. Helping everybody, simply not possible. Deporting everybody may be possible, but is there really justice in there either? So the prudence that is necessary to solve this is probably beyond our political system, but we have to try, and we have to hope that with God's help and grace we can see a way, through this and deliver justice to those who came with the best of intentions, maybe invited and they took to be an invitation, as the guards stepped aside and they walked across the border in large numbers because nobody was telling them they couldn't. I mean, that's a different person than a smuggled person or a smuggler or a criminal or those. We have to make those distinctions for it to be just.
And that's clearly why the focus, at least officially, is to be focused on those who obviously have come in and unfortunately are focused on doing things that are illegal or criminal or obviously putting our own citizens at risk, which obviously the government has. That's one of their prime responsibilities. And that's why people are concerned in the past over worrying about other countries' borders, but not seeming to be concerned that much about our own border. What's also interesting, Father Kirby, as somebody said, maybe tongue-in-cheek, they said, well, I guess climate change is over, since the last administration claimed that the reason there were so many people at our border was because of climate change. And now suddenly there's not as many people at the border, so maybe the climate change was fixed. But one of the points you made in the earlier show, abortion, and we were talking about that with the population, as Colin was just saying, maybe we need to, even as a church, move some of our priorities, maybe they don't get funded as well, but to saying, how do we support the family? How do we encourage the births? How do we get those things and make those our priority, along with evangelization as being our number one priorities? Maybe some of these things, as wonderful as they are, as mission creep, to use Mitch's term, not that he meant it in this way, but I'm saying even where you start to get distracted by other things which are wonderful, but maybe can be done by you, but maybe can be done by others as well.
Yes, very much. First, I wanted to mention, we're talking a lot about, I've mentioned prudence a lot, and I want to say that while I think prudence is rare in the political discourse today, I will say I'm filled with great hope that our vice president has begun to use some Catholic social principles, the Ordo Amoris, in public discourse. I'm hoping that this is a sign that things are changing, that maybe our Catholic politicians are beginning to realize the real treasury of wisdom contained within the Church's social doctrine. So I do hope that we begin to see more of that prudence, especially among our Catholic politicians, but obviously in the general political discourse. But to your question, Doug, I'll tell you, Pope St. John Paul II said it best: the way of humanity passes through the family. And every time we neglect the family, every time we think that we can bring about reform or address social ills and we neglect the family, we're just setting ourselves up for failure. And as Catholics in particular, this should be a given, because everything in the Catholic Church is based on family. And so I think the more we strengthen the family, the more we encourage married people to have children, the more we encourage them to both procreate and educate their children, especially in the ways of God. This is a benefit. This is a plus. I think it's a powerful move in many parts of the church right now that we're talking a lot about evangelization. But the one thing that surprises me is all these efforts for evangelization, they rarely mention the family. We oftentimes approach evangelization very in a very individualistic manner. And I think we have to be cautious of that. I think we've borrowed that from our evangelical neighbors. I think we have to be careful. I think we have to come back to the family. We have to evangelize the family. We have to make sure that that those who are called to holy matrimony understand the responsibility of welcoming children. We have to once again reinstate and emphasize the role of the Christian family, that it is to be salt, light, and leaven in the midst of the world. That if a Christian family looks the exact same as the unbelieving family across the street, there's a problem there, right? Mm-hmm. And the problem is not with the unbelieving family. The problem is with the Christian family, because they should understand that they are called to be different. There are different expectations. There's a higher command of love that's given to the Christian family. And the more we retrieve that, the more we'll be able to address some of these social ills, the more we'll be able to understand a different concept or a different way of addressing some of the issues that are facing our society. But to your point, Doug, and I want to just stress and emphasize, we've got to come back to the family. I feel like, especially in Catholic moral theology, we had that emphasis under Pope St. John Paul II. I feel as if that emphasis has been waning and weakening in more recent times.
Right. Okay, very good. Well said, and kind of wrapping things up. And I appreciate all of you being on this week's program. It's program number 2. And I personally want to thank Father Mitch Pacwa, my good friend, Father Kirby, and of course Colin Donovan for being with us as always today on this particular program. And thank you for joining us, of course, and don't forget to join us next week when the host will be Ryan Penny. He'll be discussing Catholics on social media. There's a lot of them, very interesting. That's right here on the Catholic Sphere. We'll see you next time. Thanks.